This episode may contain topics of conversation and themes sensitive to some individuals. It is our intention to talk about the impact of difficult or painful experiences rather than the graphic details of what happened. That being said, these topics may still very well be activating. Feel free to read the description or show notes for a time-stamped list of potentially activating content discussed in this episode. Please care for yourself as you listen today. We're glad you're here with us. Welcome to On Trauma and Power. I'm your host, Jenn Turner, co-founder of the Center for Trauma and Embodiment. I'm so glad you're here with us. Each episode, I sit down with different experts, educators, authors, survivors, and practitioners, sharing different trauma-informed experiences across various fields. Join us as we explore the complex intersections of trauma and power through embodied healing and diverse perspectives in both our personal and collective healing journeys. Let's dive on in. Hey, Lee, thank you so much for joining us and joining me on this conversation. I'm just going to start us with a little intro, and then maybe you can kind of ground us with a journal entry.
Sounds good. Glad to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. So today's guest, Lee Hawkins, is the author of I Am Nobody's Slave, How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free, which traces 400 years of his Black American family's lineage, revealing the deep interconnections between Black and white families and the intergenerational impact of slavery, Jim Crow, and historical trauma. Using genetic testing, investigative reporting, and historical documentation, Hawkins uncovers stories of resilience, injustice, and survival. A Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2022, Hawkins is a former Wall Street Journal reporter who worked there for 19 years. His journalism explores economic discrimination, racial violence, and land theft, and how these forces have impacted Black families across generations. His work also addresses the long-term effects of adverse childhood experiences and systemic racism. Inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King, he has long advocated for nonviolent social change. One of his main missions is to expand the nonviolent social change concept to homes, communities, and schools. Again, thank you. What an amazing bio to read and all the work that you're doing in the world. We often start this podcast with a grounding exercise, a chance to frame the conversation, to drop in, and you've offered to read us a journal entry today.
Yeah, you told me that you like people to give something personal and special, and I thought that, there was kind of a journaling process that I went through when I was writing I Am Nobody's Slave, and in 2019 or so, I went back and I found this passage, and I'll just read this to you because maybe it will help us put things into context. So I say, thank God our family survived and thrived. But the pattern of hiding and internalizing the resulting pain and depression that comes from grief as shame has been passed down. It frustrates me when I encounter people today who expect me to keep fueling this cycle of secrecy. We are no longer enslaved or living under Jim Crow laws. I'm not going to keep secrets about the murders and the injustices experienced by forgotten family members. You can forget that because it won't happen. We have no obligation to carry around the toxins of trauma. We have to stop conditioning each generation to hide their pain. Our ancestors had to do it for their survival and often led to heart attacks, strokes, and cancer. But we don't have to do that anymore. If you're battling something, please don't be afraid to discuss it or ask for help. We're powerful and resilient, but we are not superhuman, nor are we subhuman. We're built on the same framework as everybody else. We need to liberate the minds and hearts of our young people and give them the power and the freedom to tell their stories. This may be hard to hear, but internalized stress and grief do kill. If we want to increase the life expectancy of Black America and America as a whole, we must give ourselves the gift of expression, self care, and empowerment through confronting the things that happen to us with no shame. I love you all, Paul.
Wow.
I mean, it gives you a sense of, and I think at that time I was really thinking about a group that I was speaking to of psychoanalysts, the Harlem Family Institute, which is a group that trains people to become certified psychoanalysts. And a lot of the things that I was dealing with at that time had to do with the guilt that came from telling all these secrets and explaining not just the intergenerational trauma within one family, but the intergenerational trauma that has been passed down through the generations in our country. And, that larger parallel in which, both in our families and in our country, we've been expected to try to push down the difficult things, the dark parts, and to focus on more on the light than the darkness. But what that does is it makes people sick. We know that, but it stands in the way of future generations having the level of enlightenment that they deserve.
Hmm. Hmm. What stood out to me, I think, from that entry was that we no longer, I think something about we no longer have the obligation to carry our family's pain or of holding our family's pain. So I hear that in that, right, that struggle of, but do I, or do we? That guilt, right? And maybe it's a question or just a thing that you were wrangling with at that time. It sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, it was something that my therapist, who is a guy named Dr. Lee Jenkins, who actually lived through Jim Crow apartheid, as I call it. When I was a kid, I grew up thinking that what my father lived through in Alabama growing up in the 1950s was just segregation. That's what we were all taught, that the worst of it was water fountains and being separate and Black people sitting in the back of the bus. But I didn't realize the extent to which racial violence and homicide was a big part of it. And my family was affected by that. So it was important to have a therapist who had lived through Jim. Um, and, my therapist, Dr. Jenkins, is in his 80s now. And, I just think he has such a profound understanding of these issues. And it was him who helped me understand that by uncovering the fact that there are 9 million living African Americans who survived through American apartheid and have never been acknowledged as apartheid survivors, um, that would ultimately be a good thing, of course, but the long term benefit would be there, but the short term benefit would be all of the pain that would come from having to reflect back on the murders in my family, which there's been a murder in my family every generation since 1837, including my grandfather and both of my great grandfathers, in Alabama. And their primary crime, for all of these people was land ownership. I mean, it was just so rooted in the founding of our country. And so unpacking all of that and having to piece together how it affected my grandparents and how having their fathers murdered when they were children and how it affected my father, and the pressure that he felt to keep secrets from me because I never knew that his father was murdered until I did this project. And then I found out myself and went to him, and he explained to me what happened or what he knew about what happened. And his father and mother kept their father's murders from him. And so every generation kept secrets from the next generation. And I think when I wrote this, I was just kind of reflecting on that to try to give myself a boost, you know,
Yeah.
so that I could continue to move forward.
I'm curious about how you would reflect on the role of secrets. Like, I want to turn us to like, how did you start this book and what led you? But I don't want to lose sight of the power of secrecy and what we get taught about that and and what it's like to break that, especially with a book like this.
Yeah, I think it's right on mark because that's exactly why I wanted to write the book. That's what led me to write the book, is this understanding that so many secrets have been kept from me, and I did not know what my family's history was in America. I didn't know when we came here. I didn't know very much about my ancestors. Didn't even know anything about my grandparents on my father's side, and all of them were in Alabama. But I was this kid growing up in Minnesota, and all I knew was that my father moved to Minnesota from Alabama when he was 12 in 1961 as a result of his mother's death. He would never speak about Alabama. He would never speak about his mother, very rarely. But I did know that obviously there were some things that had happened there because my father would have nightmares occasionally when I was a kid. And whenever I would muster the courage to ask him what he was dreaming about, he would just say, Alabama, son, Alabama. But he would never go into detail. So um, the fact that he wouldn't go into detail, it just produced a longing in me to know what happened because I wanted to know what produced those nightmares and what could make this man who loved me so much and was so omnipresent in my life resort to violence against me as a child whenever you know whenever he felt that I was breaking rules or that could get me in trouble in the broader society. And so yeah, the secrecy part and also the movie Roots was a big influence on me. I saw it when I was young, and I there's a harrowing scene of Kunta Kinte, who is the main character, and he's actually whipped in that scene for refusing to take the name that the colonizer wanted to give him. And in that moment, as a young child, I even saw the parallel between the use of the whip on that plantation and the use of the belt in my own home. And I wondered if there was a connection and if it had anything to do with family members who had been enslaved, because I had no idea if slavery had affected us or how it had affected us. And so when I became a journalist, um, I found myself being able to answer all of these questions and do all of these incredible investigations about everything but my family. I'm there, I could uncover almost anything, but I couldn't tell you who my great grandparents were on my father's side and or what happened in Alabama. So it was, the secrets that made me, with any journalist, when you keep secrets, it just makes them, more determined to get to the bottom of them. And so I think it was part of it. And it was also wanting to help my dad because my dad started to open up once he saw that I had taken a DNA test through ancestry.com and I was starting to come and share information with him and information that had been kept from him in articles and old newspapers and things like that. And he just opened up and it had a profound impact on my life and my relationship with my dad.
It's so moving to hear you speak about that, um, your capacity to both, experience harm at the hands of your father and also to come at it with a desire to help, to understand, to explore. To me, I just find that so moving to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, thank you. Once again, it's important. I didn't even understand at the time that for all but 60 years of America's existence, white supremacy was the law. And that's not a political statement. It's a very controversial two words to use with people, um, to say that America was a white supremacist country for all but 60 years of its existence. And I think the reason is once again because of the secrets that have been kept, even in our educational system, and the way that we have idealized our country's narrative. I love this country, and I think because of my love for the country, it behooved me to go back and to really look at what my family lived through. And I think 95% of the people who make commentary on enslavement or make commentary on the civil rights movement or the period of segregation that I'm referring to really don't have the faintest idea of how severe the racial violence and the homicide was in those periods. And so I think that setting the stage now, I just want to make it clear that this work that I do applies to my family as survivors of apartheid, but it also applies to people from any family who's gone through significant trauma, particularly political, social, or economic related injustice, Holocaust, Japanese internment, um, Armenian genocide. There are all kinds of things that families had gone through. You know, people have left countries and fled to come here for a better opportunity. But when they come here, they still bring a lot of those experiences, and that can haunt the bloodline if not addressed through generations. And so a lot of my work, you know, intergenerational trauma is a term that in some ways some would say it's been overused, but I don't think so. I just think it's commonly used now because it is such a part of our historical narrative as families and as a country. And the best thing that we can do for ourselves now is to lean in on all of that and try our best to not have it define who we are, but certainly find ways to um, confront and move along past it or with it in a way that we can manage it going forward for generations.
Right. And I mean, I think that intergenerational trauma is so omnipresent. And so the reason it may feel like we're talking about it a lot is because we're waking up in this moment and we may fall asleep again, but waking up to the reality of the presence of that. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about apartheid and how you landed on using that word that I'm sure for some people is like a lightning rod.
Well, I landed on it because there's a woman named Dr. Ruth Thompson Miller who wrote a book about Jim Crow before me, which I read. And her book was much more academic in that sense because she is an academic. My book is really a story about one family through the generations, and it reads like a novel, right? It's nonfiction, but it really reads in that way as opposed to me taking positions. And, you know, when I spoke with her about her experience, she had mentioned that she was in South Africa doing research as, I think, as a PhD candidate. And she was interviewing people, and it just occurred to her, was very clear that it was the same thing that her father lived through, right? Um, I call myself an intergeneration or a integration generation child. And what I meant by that was that, and also a first generation American. And the reason I call myself a first generation American is even though my family's been here since the 1600s, and I'm a descendant of Revolutionary War soldiers and Civil War soldiers, and even my father enlisted in the Vietnam era Air Force when I was a baby. I'm the first generation or part of the first generation of my family to be born under the Constitution equal to a white person. And, you know, knowing that has implications because it then made sense why my father was so afraid for me as a kid. Um, Afraid. And it wasn't just, if you go to that party, you could get in trouble. It was, if you go to that party, you could be killed. You could be hung from a tree. The whole family could be killed. And, that to me was a very severe way for him to look at things. And for me and for my younger sister, we were kids who grew up in the Black community on the weekends, where our family and our church was, but we went to school in a predominantly Scandinavian high school in Minnesota, which was very suburban. And we did well. We did well socially. I was a class president all 4 years. My sister was a homecoming queen and the class president all 3 years. We had a ton of friends of different races and backgrounds, mainly white people who were blonde hair. Um, and that was hard for my dad. That was hard because his mind was still very much locked in a very, Alabama and the segregation there. And he had very little faith in the benevolence uh, or trustworthiness of white people. And so, whenever a situation came up with my activism or something, if I gave a speech that might have been a little too, boisterous or whatever, he would share those concerns. Um, in my life in general as a kid, I got the belt over 150 times. And it wasn't just me. I mean, I knew a lot of Black kids around me in my neighborhood, the few who lived in my neighborhood, but also a lot who I knew in the city who had parents and grandparents from Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, Texas, who had been raised under Jim Crow. And it wasn't until I did this work that I recognized how close in proximity we were to people who actually lived on plantations and were enslaved, and living under the whip every day. So these were our great grandparents. Well, my father's grandfather was born into slavery. And so in my book, I talk about my great great grandmother, Charity Pugh, who was the last generation of our family to live under enslavement. She lived under in bondage for 30 years. And then the last 60 years, she lived under Jim Crow apartheid. And the reason I know about her was because we actually did go one time to Alabama in 1991, when I was an aspiring journalist, not a very good one either. But the key was that we interviewed an uncle who was 93 at the time, and he was talking about his childhood in Alabama and talking about his father and how sad he was that his father was murdered for his land and in a livestock dispute as well. And that was my great grandfather who was killed, and he was the son of Charity Pugh, and he was telling us all about his grandmother, Charity Pugh, and how on his father's farm, she was the one who would supervise them. And if they weren't working fast enough, she would whip them. And so he called her a mean old lady, but he did not tell me that she was enslaved. I had to find that out in my research. And when I pieced together her life, I started to recognize that during that period, there was a system called the pushing system, which was a system which, after the cotton gin was developed, um, when the enslavers um, got the cotton gins, they went to the bank to get the cotton gins. Um, well, they needed to get more labor, more cotton production from the enslaved people, but a lot of times they didn't have the credit to do that. So they had to get more out of what they had. And they used the pushing system, which was just basically a system in which, at the end of the day, the cotton was weighed, and anybody who didn't meet quota would be whipped in front of everyone. And that was something that people lived under every day. They knew that if they didn't meet their quota, this would happen. And so that kind of hypervigilance and stress on the parasympathetic nervous system is, unbearable and unimaginable. But it was something that I understood at that time because I had understood trauma. I had studied trauma and the way that the parasympathetic nervous system and the fight or flight system reacts when it's triggered over and over and over and over and over. It hardwires you for anxiety, which was, cortisol, adrenaline. And this is what my great great grandmother lived under. But it's important to note that we knew her, that my family knew her, and that was the first time that I gained the understanding that, you know, our ancestors who lived under slavery, she died in the 1930s. Okay. And so um, they were so close in proximity to us generationally that we would be grossly mistaken if we were to think that they would have no impact on our socialization, on our worldview, and everything. And so I now understood how the belt basically came into my family and how it was passed down through the generations, because the system of slavery and also the slave codes, which were enforced by the government, which said that Grandma Charity would get 39 to 100 lashes if she was reading or writing, or if she was with four other black people without a white person present, 39 to 100 lashes. And who would administer the punishment? There were no police then. Back then they had, it was a requirement for every white man between the ages of 18 and 45 to do one night a week of slave patrol. And they all had a whip and they all had a gun, and their job was to police Grandma Charity and everybody in Butler County who was under enslavement. And not to mention, when I took the DNA test, I found out that the enslaver, um, who she was owned by, was my blood relative. And so that started to introduce the idea of sexual assault, but also that he was the justice of the peace of Butler County, which meant that he was over all of the slave patrol, and that he was the person who actually administered punishment on many occasions, but also encouraged and controlled the controllers, basically. And so for her to live in that environment, basically, where she was constantly under threat, it's no wonder why she was a mean old lady, according to my my grand uncle. But the key is that she was also a strong lady who survived and thrived despite America, and what America had done to her. And so if we want to be honest about improving our families and improving our country, then we have to be honest about the history and to confront it so that we can start to process it, analyze it, and move past it.
Again, there's so much love in that sentiment, right? To look at the story of someone who, you knew to whip or beat your family members, who is your grandma Charity, and then to look at her through as a survivor that she is and was, right? And to me, that's, I think, what we talked about, maybe even on another call around um, that act of curiosity being one of the highest or the highest form of love, and how potent that is, and what an antidote that is.
Yeah, I mean, shame is powerful. And so, one of the things that's happening in Florida right now is they're ripping books out of the curriculums and enacting laws that say that content that makes any student feel guilty should be banned from school. And of course, you're talking about Caucasian students um, who might see part of themselves in the narratives of the people who came before. And I just think it's such a cruel thing to do, particularly to Caucasian students, because it kind of makes them, it shelters them in a way that it keeps them in a homogenous environment and experience. And they're going to be thrust into a world where that is not their grandparents' America, that is much more diverse. And they actually really need to know this history and the stories behind their professors and their bosses at work and or their coworkers at work and different people um, who have come into the American experience in different ways. And so, what a cruel thing to do to sentence them to ignorance because of a failure of the educational system. And so, um, when I say the highest form of love is curiosity, what I mean is, um, why did we enter into genocide against the indigenous people? Why did we use Black people to build up the country? Why was there subjugation of women for all of these generations, and what was the impact, as opposed to fixating on the judgment of things that we can't change, right? And even in my own family, my father, as I say, I know that my father loved me just by the amount of time that he spent with me, and his belief that I could achieve anything that I wanted to if I put my mind to it. But the key was that when I did this work, I had to understand the level of guilt that he was carrying. And I wanted to know more why these things happen and how they came about. What were you experiencing in Alabama? What did you bring into to Minnesota with you when you had your own children? What were your primary fears for me? And I think that taking that approach and giving him a chance to talk as opposed to talking at him through the lens of anger that I was feeling in my, in my early 30s when I started to have my own nightmares. That wouldn't have been productive for me to stay in that place. I do think that anger is appropriate and expressed and should be expressed appropriately, because I think particularly minoritized and marginalized people, women, people of color, people with special needs, all kinds of people who are on the fringes of society are often not allowed to express the full range of human emotion. That when they show anger, it's, oh, look at this angry, nasty woman. Look at this angry Black man. Or, look at this crazy person. Like, you don't want to trigger those stereotypes. But what that does is to not have a liberated sense of expression, um, is a penalty that will end up making you have to turn inward and turn it on yourself. And so it's healthy to get it out. It's healthy to communicate directly with people. And when I did that with my dad, I was able to get past that dark place that I talk about in my book, where I tell the whole story, where my father and I didn't speak for over 2 years as a result of that anger. Um, and then I chronicle that evolution to how we were able to get to this place. And at the heart of it was me finally understanding that the highest form of love that I could show for my dad would be to be curious as opposed to judgmental.
So powerful. I wonder if we might also, my brain is going in two directions. I'm thinking about what you also said around sentencing people to ignorance. Um, I mean, that is profound, and curious to also understand more about your process of, moving through that. And, people can also read the book for sure, right? It's so powerful and brilliant. But wondering if you might share just a little bit more about moving through that anger to get to curiosity, because I think it is so heavily stigmatized, like you name. And and oftentimes there's fear wrapped up in anger because we may have received anger from others in abusive and harmful ways. And so we can be afraid to touch our own, because what if we touch within ourselves the capacity to harm others, or that intensity.
Yeah, I think working through anger is something that is a process. And I think the biggest, in my own experience, I think the biggest frustration that I had with both of my parents when I was trying to get help about reflecting on those, having nightmares and reflecting on the belt whippings of my childhood, was that I couldn't get them to take responsibility for it. I couldn't get them to acknowledge that it was abuse, right? There's this very tricky, there's a tricky part of the experience of Black Americans who descend from slavery and Jim Crow, um, that makes us think, many of us, I don't want to speak on behalf of everyone, but I'll speak on behalf of, my family and a lot of the people who I've discussed this with, that violence is a form of love. Because if it's seen as a form of protection, as a form of wanting to beat the children, to make them scared so that to scare them into perfect behavior, then it's not really seen as something that was done in a malicious way, right? So that, and then also the incredible reverence and respect that we have for elders, and that we're required as children to be seen and not heard, almost, to not give our opinion, to not speak out, to not get angry. Um, and that obviously is a legacy, comes from the legacy of slavery as well. And the way that children needed to be, for survival, socialized, in order to survive. If your parent told you, sit in this barn and don't leave until I come back, don't you dare leave, right? Well, that could be a life or death situation. Or if that child left, they could be branded an errant child and then be sold away from the family. And so, because this was so close in proximity generationally, we still kept, without even knowing what had happened to our ancestors, we kept these practices in the family system. And you could be someone who's 32 years old and a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, filled with fear about expressing your opinion to your parent about how you were treated as a child. And that's the situation that I found myself in. And it was very difficult for me to hear them say, we did that because we loved you. How dare you tell us that that was abuse? We did that because you deserved it, because you broke the rules, and to not acknowledge even that they did that, right? That was a part too that was just crazy. Um, my father had the character enough to eventually admit to that, and then that was when we got it. My anger started to subside when I ended up going to counseling and getting the apology, that I needed. I didn't need a lot more than that. I needed an acknowledgement and an apology, and I think that people who don't get that, are more likely to stay in that anger phase, um, sometimes for an entire lifetime. And the issue, I would never rush anybody along in their process of confronting anger. Um, and I believe that everybody should feel that emotion and allow themselves to go through that full range of human emotion. But it's important to understand that if your peace depends on somebody else giving you the validation that you need to move forward, that's problematic. And so that's where the soul searching and the reflection has to come in, because oftentimes people are not even here. People who have committed atrocities against us are long gone or dead or whatever it is. And we have to figure out a way to move, to express that anger and to live in that anger in most productive way and safe way possible without staying there. And I think that's where the professionals like you come in. I mean, and community support. For me, I have a loving little sister who had experienced a lot of the things that I experienced, and having her and talking to her about the aspects of our childhood, because in other ways we had a great childhood, but the aspects of our childhood that involved violence, that was very powerful for me to have her as that support network that I needed, because validated each other long before our parents took responsibility for their part of it.
I think it's so powerful how having a witness to trauma can completely transform the experience, both during it, but even more so in the processing and understanding the echoes of trauma and the impact of trauma on our body, on our minds. When someone can validate and say, yes, that did happen. Yes, I was there. And because I think we are programmed, particularly with our families, toward loyalty. And loyalty is often intertwined or conflated with protection, which maybe it's not conflated. Actually, maybe that is loyalty. But to be able to name and acknowledge someone that you love and can and counted on also perpetuated harm, it's really hard to do in isolation. Most of us tend to then turn toward whether it's gaslighting ourselves or denial of what happened.
Yes, and I love what you just said about loyalty and protection, because those of us, I think that there are people in every family. Some people call them the black sheep. I call them the cycle breaker. The person who understands that some of the cycles that we're seeing in this family system are toxic. I refuse to carry them forward. I want a different situation for my parents, or for my parents if they're still living, but also for my children. Most important for my children, right? And I don't want my children to go through the things that I had to go through. And those people are very courageous, brave people, because studies show, as you know, and most people know watching this podcast, that it's more likely for people to repeat the practices, particularly go corporal punishment. I mean, if you received the belt, especially in the 70s and the 80s, I mean, there are a lot of people who were experiencing that. Many people, even today, will say the problem with today is that we're not beating the kids enough. That's what we need. We need to bring that back. And they don't say it that clearly, but that's basically what people say. There's a glorification and a glamorization of using physical force against children. And so it's really, really hard to break that cycle. So people who decide that they're going to be different with their children are really, really, in my opinion, some of the bravest people, because we know how powerful the feelings of love and loyalty and protection are, and the guilt that can come with feeling like you're disloyal because you decided not to be your children. And that's crazy. Or because you took issue with the fact that the practice was used in your home or in your school, where right now 17 states still have legal authorization to beat children in schools, and they're mainly the slavery states in the South, and it's happening disproportionately to Black and brown children, and children with special needs. But it happens to a lot of different children, and, I've met people who have gone through that experience and wanted to challenge that, and that they, once again, because of what happened to them at home and at school, that they had decided that they would never do that to their child. And I would say that that to me is true loyalty to your family and true protection of your family, because what it says is, as we evolve through the generations, our goal in the context of the American dream is to redeem the sacrifices of the previous generation. I don't care what background you come from, whether your family is first generation, second generation, or whether you've been here for many, many generations, we are hardwired to believe that every generation, it should get better. And sometimes people say it is money, right? But I will expand on that. It's not, it really doesn't have as much to do with generational wealth, which is very important. And I know I write about that. But to me, it's emotional wealth, psychological wealth. You know, the idea of being able to rid yourself of the demons that haunted your bloodline, um, and understanding if you believe in the ancestors, and in the power of the ancestors, you have to know that your ancestors, if they didn't know while they were here that it was wrong, they certainly know now. Anybody who would use that wisdom and that evolution and education, um, and all of the different things that empower us, because when we know better, we do better. Anybody who would break those cycles is actually doing a great service to their ancestors, as opposed to being disloyal to them. It's the best thing that you can do for your bloodline and your family system going into the future.
One thing that I've learned from you is that, it's in a new way, is that it's also not just on the backs of individuals or families, that these cycles can be broken but then brought back into existence by systems like you mentioned, and schools and government. And I wondered if you might share a bit about the story of your grandmother who broke the cycle, and then how corporal punishment got reintroduced in your family. That to me is like very stark explanation of the interlocking systems that we exist in.
Yeah, thank you for letting me do this, talk about my grandmother, because, I never got to meet her. Her name was Opie Pugh Hawkins, and she was um, the daughter of Isaac Pugh Sr., who was killed in 1914. He was actually killed on my birthday. I was born on August 28th. He was killed on August 28th, 1914. And, when I was a kid, I would see things on PBS, and they were all about the civil rights movement. And they were all black and white, the marchers and the dogs and the fire hoses and Dr. Martin Luther King. And it's crazy because, this was the early 70s, and it wasn't really that long before. The civil rights movement was really the 60s. And yet, and still, because it was in black and white and it was always presented so grainy, I would think it was so long ago, and I would ask my dad, Dad, did grandma and grandpa, did they march in the civil rights movement? And my dad told me, no way. As a matter of fact, my grandmother, your grandmother used to say that Martin Luther King, he better stop that what he's doing, speaking out against these white folks, because they're going to end up killing him. And I was always very ashamed of that, because I was a student who actually did a lot of forensics, and I gave the Martin Luther King speech in high school at a lot of different debate competitions and stuff. And I was just, a student of nonviolent social change. And I remember being ashamed of my grandmother, and that because that was one of the only things that my father would tell me about Alabama. But when I did this work and I found out the why, right? The fact that her father, I had to figure out that she was 9 when her father was murdered. And when I got the newspaper accounts and then pieced that together with all of the oral history and realized that after he was shot, he was on a mule, and he was shot in the back when he was on a mule, and the mule rode him home. His feet were still in the stirrups. And my grandmother and her brothers and sisters came outside, and they saw their father's blood and bullet riddled body. And she was 9 years old. So that gave me the sensitivity to understand, of course, she thought that Martin Luther King should be quiet, probably out of love and protection for Martin Luther King, but also just because we're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get us, right? The truth was they did kill Martin Luther King for his activism. So she was right. But when my father started to open up even more about his mother, that was when I understood how powerful of a force for nonviolent social change she was, because um, she would have also been paddled by Grandma Charity. But my father talked about how she only hit him 2 times, and there were both times. One of the times was when he was drinking out of a water fountain that he wasn't supposed to be drinking out of at a store, and she had to do that in a very performative way for the benefit of the white people who were there. And another time, he was on a swing with the white girl, and she did it then, but he explained that she was a very peaceful woman and that she did not believe in that with him, and it was the school that actually corporally punish my dad. If you show up late, anything, any kind of infraction, it was a wooden board that said Board of Education on it, and it had holes. And my father learned through that for the first 12 years of his life that, that was the way to discipline a child. And that was introduced into his mind because he didn't get it from his mother. And that was enough for him to introduce that and use that in our home. And you'll see in the book, if you read the book, I talk about um, my father witnessing my grandmother standing in the way of situations that involved domestic violence against women. And, it just took me so long, but I finally, as I pieced together my grandmother's life and her experience, I recognized that she was about nonviolent social change just as powerfully as Dr. Martin Luther King was. And I see a lot of the work that I do. I see myself, I see her in that work. I see that I'm in a position to do things that she was unable to do as a Black woman in her time, who was born in the early part of the 20th century. Um, and so to use, once again, talking about the redeeming the sacrifices of previous generations, so that we can do the things that our ancestors were unable to do is really, really powerful. And what I see now is that my work really aspires to expand on what Dr. Martin Luther King promised America. He said we would be free of violence when we protest, right? And so they were in the basement of churches, and they did everything they could to train every freedom rider, every protester, and they would basically do drills in the basement of churches, and they would say, we're going to spit on you. We're going to call you names. We're going to do all of these things. And if you use violence back, you can't march with us. Right. And so my work really expands on that by saying, why don't we introduce nonviolent social change in our homes? Can men make that promise to their wives? Can they make that to their children? Can mothers make that to their children? Can communities make that as communities to stop the homicide crisis that we're seeing in our community? And can schools abolish corporal punishment so that our children are not hardwired for anxiety as they go through the years? And so that renewed commitment to nonviolent social change is something that I was able to see when I studied my grandmother and I saw the ways she tried to keep violence out of her surroundings and to give my father a peace of life.
So much of what I hear as you talk about intergenerational trauma is also intergenerational healing and the potential for that, and that how that has also transpired in your history. I don't know if I'm inflating that or not, but it keeps coming through in my mind as you're talking.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, this book leans into trauma, and I do it in a very intentional way because I don't want this. I think so many people try to skirt over it with respect to African Americans, but the key for me is that I've had I do show how the relationship with my father was healed and how we were able to work for over 20 years on perfecting our relationship. I would say that that was the closest friendship that I've ever had, and one that I'll never have a friendship that close than the one that I had with my father. And I think a lot of it had to do with the extreme honesty, and the fact that we were able to go there and to work through these things, and to come out with such tremendous respect for each other. And I think to have that 20 years of that kind of relationship with my dad was really powerful, and therein lies the healing. I think what else, if there's anything that I'm proud of about this process, is having been contacted by cousins, people from Alabama, and from all over the nation who I've never met, who have shown up at my readings. And some of these people, the tightness of those hugs and the tightness of those hugs of these cousins that you're meeting for the first time. And that's not just the black ones, but it's also the ones who are white, who I met um, as a result of taking that DNA test and actually did research with. The tightness of those hugs, it's a feeling that you can't get enough of, because all of these people who tell me that they're so proud of me, and that they have gone through their own journeys as a result of this, um, is powerful, because we do come from the same family, and which means that we were socialized in the same way, and we have a lot of the same experiences. And even my white cousins, who I'm related to because of slavery, they received corporal punishment. Of course they did, right? Because that was on the other side of the bloodline. Um, and many of them as well are just very encouraging. And the fact that we even speak, and um, that we have embarked upon this work together, once again, I think is, that's the kind of healing that we need in America. That's the kind of loyalty and protection we need to talk to the people who were on the other side of slavery, to talk to the people who lived on the other side of Jim Crow, and to understand that we can't change the past, but we certainly can affect our present and shape our future. And so much of the work that I do around healing has to do with having a conversation. We had slavery, but we also had emancipation. We had Jim Crow, but we also had the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And by the way, there wasn't a black person in the Senate or the Congress at that time, and the president was a good old boy from Texas. But they got it done, and they got it done through dialogue. I don't think we could do that now, today, in the political climate that we're in today. And so a lot of my work is to try to bring people together, by confronting the hardest parts of our family narratives and our country's narrative.
I could talk with you and listen to you all day. This is your journalist or your storytelling coming through. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. I really hope that people go and read your book, and check out other things that you're doing and the projects that you're up to. Is there anything that we didn't get to today that's top of mind or that you'd like to shine forward?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for this opportunity and for the work that you're doing. I believe this is God's work. I believe that mental health and childhood trauma are probably the most important issues, confronting our world today. And so anything we can do to lean into that, is critical. And so I would say that what my goal is to proliferate the world with this book and to try to get into teachers who are teaching high school AP courses and professors who are teaching college undergraduate courses, because once again, this book is a story about trauma and intergenerational healing, but it is told through the story of one Black American family, and it really is written in the same way that, you know, the books that we really admire that just tell the story and allow the reader to draw the conclusions are written. So there, and then I'll just say this last thing. For some reason, and I don't know, it just seems to be happening very organically. Um, I've been contacted by returning citizens, you know, groups that work with justice impacted people who are now in society and dealing with a lot of the the trauma to speak to them. And you know, the one thing that I'm realizing that I really need to do now is to commit myself to also talking to prisons, talking to people who have been incarcerated, talking to people who have had that situation in which they're now living with the mistake they made, or with a felony on their record and trying their best to navigate through. And as they do that, I'm hoping that this story about how I dealt with a lot of the things that haunted me from childhood as an adult will help people who read it so that they can begin to, you know, address all the other issues that they have to. And I think that, you know, it's a forgotten aspect. Children are a forgotten part of our society. They're the most vulnerable but the least protected. So I want to make sure that I get to the young people, but I also see people who have paid their debt to society as a group that I also want to touch.
Yeah, amazing. Um, I think that we could probably have a conversation around enslavement in modern day in the prison system, but maybe we can do a follow up at some point.
Yeah, I'll find out when I get out there and talk to people. But I will say that the education and literacy is the primary way that will enable them to not go back. And so that's why reading a book that's engaging, that is not just a textbook and really a story of American history, I think would benefit a lot of the people who are dealing with these issues. And the audio book is, I narrated it, so, and I tried hard to make it as good as possible. So I hope people check it out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this conversation and for sharing your powerful work with us.
Thank you again. Keep up the good work.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to share a quick reminder about an opportunity for healing professionals who want to deepen their work with somatic trauma-informed practices. The Trauma Center Trauma Sensitive Yoga Certification Program is our 300-hour online training that supports practitioners around the world in offering safe, embodied healing experiences grounded in decades of research and practice. Our next cohort starts in September, and applications are open until August 15th. And if you still need to complete the required 20-hour foundational training, you can join one anytime. Our facilitators offer them online and in person all year long. To learn more, start your journey with us at traumasensitiveyoga.com. Thank you so much for being with us today. To find out more about today's guest, head to healwithcfte.org/podcast. Follow us on Instagram @OnTraumaAndPower to stay up to date on future episodes. And be sure to like and subscribe to On Trauma and Power wherever you listen to your podcast. We'll see you next time. Take care.